Kia ora te whānau, Iokaraiti ko Andrew Doubleday aho. Today we're looking at the Gospel Lectionary for Sunday the 28th of July 2024, and it's John chapter 6 verses 1 through to 21. We've moved away from Mark's Gospel. This story that we're going to read is actually found in Mark's Gospel, and it was bookended by the text that we had last week with the two separate journeys of Jesus, and this is the bit in the middle. But now we've moved to the same story but in John's Gospel. So we pick it up at John chapter 6 verse 1. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now, there was a great deal of grass in that place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he'd given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that are left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. Other translations say 12 large baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough, because a strong wind was blowing. When they'd rowed 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Now, we find this feeding of the 5,000 in all 4 Gospels, followed by the walking on the water after Jesus' solo prayer session in 3 of them. We don't find it in Luke, but we do in the other 3. It's Matthew, Mark and John. It's all there. And the Gospel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000 is remarkably consistent. Their stories do not contradict one another. As I've been reflecting on this and how it looks from where I sit, I was reminded of 2 stories that we find in the books of Kings, one concerning Elijah and the other concerning his successor Elisha. And it seemed to me that they're useful lenses through which we might see the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So let's pick up the story of Elijah first. We find it in 1 Kings 17, verses 7 through to 16. Now, as context, Elijah is hiding. He's hiding from Jezebel Jezebel's out for his blood, and he has been hiding in the Kidron brook, and he's been fed by ravens, but the brook dries up because there has been a drought that's going for the best part of 3 years, and consequently a famine. There's no water, there's no rain, and food is becoming very, very scarce. So we pick up the narrative at verse 7 of 1 Kings 17. Sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there." Now, for me, I'm fascinated by this instruction to go to Zarephath, because Jezebel's father was a Sidonian king. Zarephath was part of his territory, and they were looking everywhere for Elijah. And here he was going to be hiding, I want to suggest, in plain sight, right under their noses. So go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there, gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have a drink?" He's actually asking a lot. You know, there's been a 3-year drought. Water is a precious commodity. As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." What? He wants to be fed as well? "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself, for my son, that we may eat it and die." This is how desperate her situation is. She's gathering some firewood so she can make the last little meal for her and her son, because they have nothing left. Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So here we have it. They got every day just what they needed. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through to 7, the narrative moves to Elisha, Elijah's successor. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets came to Elisha. "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my boys as his slaves." How awful for a mother. Her economic situation's so depressed that she has to sell her sons into slavery. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a little oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons, Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him, and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." So, now to Jesus in northern Galilee, as they're sitting on the side of the hill. What happened on this day on this hillside with all these people? Well, I don't know. I can't say for sure. The record, though, is unanimous. All the Gospels tell the same story. All these people were well fed, and there was food left over, much more than they had started with. We could use the Elijah stories as lenses, as models, as ways of putting the loaves and fish story into a kind of Old Testament continuum. And I can kind of imagine Jesus putting the loaves and fish into one of the baskets, maybe a large basket, popping it in. And as he's praying, he then starts to take out bread and fish and puts it into the other baskets and just keeps filling them. And there are now 12, because we discovered later on, there are 12 large baskets that have all got the bread and the fish in them. And he gives one to each disciple and saying, "Okay, off you go into the crowd and start feeding them." And it doesn't matter how much comes out, it's always still got bread and fish in there. And people are taking out what they need and away they go until everybody has what they want. And I can imagine just as it's coming to the end, the last few people, that the baskets are now empty. 5,000 plus people have been fed. And then Jesus sends the disciples out again, this time to gather up all the leftovers. And the baskets again are filled up. It's great, isn't it? Now, for those of us who embrace the miraculous, why not? It could have happened this way. It would be consistent with the biblical narrative, with the story of Moses and the manna, with the story of Elijah and the flour and the oil, with the story of Elisha and the oil. But if the story's too fanciful for you, I leave you to put whatever interpretation on it you need to. But here's the thing, and I hope it's something that we can all agree on. What the story tells us, that our God is a God of abundance. That our God is a Christ-like God, that our God is generous. None of those who came to Jesus that day went away hungry. All were fed. No matter how big the need was, and there were a lot of people there, yet they all got what they needed. All their needs were met. All of them went away full. And I wonder that for a good number of them, perhaps it was the first really full meal that they may have had in years. And in this, Jesus is demonstrating what God is like. Our God is Christ-like, is generous, is not wanting anyone to miss out. Having said all that, let's acknowledge that our world is an unfair place. A world of haves and have-nots. A world where a smaller number do very well on the backs of a much larger number, most of whom do quite poorly. What Jesus does here is demonstrates that this is not God's way. It's not God's purpose. It's not God's desire. Jesus' God is a God of plenty, where there is more than enough to go round. If only, even in this country that we used to refer to as God's own. You know that the wealthiest 10% own 1/4 of the wealth of the country's assets, 25%, while the poorest 50%, the poorest half, has just 2%, a smidgen. The poorest 50% have 1/50th of the country's wealth. Mahatma Gandhi said, "There's enough in this world for everyone's need, not for everyone's greed." The fact that there is want today in the world is not because God is miserly. It's because we are. God's world has more than enough to go around. And Jesus demonstrates God's bounty. It's us as human beings that are the problem. We live, unfortunately, in a world that are run by the super wealthy for the super wealthy. The reality is that they make the rules that run economies first and foremost to benefit themselves. Now, I'm quite a keen follower, a student, you could almost say, of American politics. And I like to describe America as having the best democracy that money can buy. Because that's exactly what happens. The uber rich buy politicians to make sure that their interests are protected first and foremost. Quite galling. One of the things I find disturbing, though, is in our own country, it's naive to imagine that we're not following some way behind down a similar path. And the truth is that it would not matter how much God opened the spigot of material blessing. This group would still claim the lion's share, because for them enough is never enough. We would still have the uber wealthy and the great poverty-riven underclass. In the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus demonstrates God's abundance. That people continue today to be in want, it's actually on us. Amen. God bless you.